A very good welcome to one and all present here. It gives me a great pleasure in interacting with this audience at this forum, and I am thankful to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. As we all know, the pandemic has wrecked the world to a great extent, which we couldn't even imagine some time back. No country is spared from being affected socially, economically, and from development perspective. 44 million people at least are expected to be pushed into extreme poverty by 2030. 52% of world's student population are or have been affected by the pandemic. The high damage scenario even models the world where economic growth is lower than the current projections and productivity is lower to recover, and more than 1 billion people worldwide could be living in extreme poverty by 2030. Obviously, in this bleak scenario, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were targeted to be achieved by the year 2030, is obviously lagging behind. But they were lagging behind the schedule in almost every country, even before the pandemic. With the unprecedented and overwhelming effect of the pandemic, the progress is even halted, and they have been rather reversed in some cases. A focused set of sustainable development goal interventions could not only prevent the rise of extreme poverty, but could actually accelerate the development trajectory that were cited during the pre-pandemic times. Still, it would lift an additional 146 million people out of extreme poverty, narrow the gender poverty gap, reduce the female poverty headcount by 74 million, even taking into account the current impacts of the pandemic all over the globe. These sustainable development goals include elements of physical, social, natural, and human capital, which are essential for creating a favorable business environment. The post pandemic economies can promote competitiveness by improving the product market conditions, focusing on achieving the goals. As we all know, SDGs 1 to 5 that were related to no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well being, quality education, and gender equality are concerned with demographic parameters that improve the labor market conditions. So, improving on these SDGs could actually have a direct effect on the business scenario as well. SDG 8, which talks about decent work and economic growth, and SDG 9, which is actually related to industry and innovation, focus on the output markets and innovation perspectives. The worsening of poverty and inequalities, that is, deviations from SDG 1 and SDG 10, respectively, that affect the local market demand. So, these inequalities, these poverty, are naturally hindrances in making a business growth. Hindrances in the progress in industry, innovation, and infrastructure disturbs profitability, slows down naturally the economic growth. Delay in achieving gender equality that were talked about in SDG 5 are inhibitors of economic growth, especially in developing economies. Obviously, as the fulfillments are not up to the desired level, the projections are also bleak. Projections suggested that 6% of the global population would still be living in extreme poverty in 2030, even missing the target of ending poverty by that time. The under 5 mortality rate had fallen by almost 50% between 2010 and 2018, but obviously the progress needed to accelerate in 53 countries, two-thirds of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that needs a great attention towards this issue. Food insecurity was already on the rise, up from 22.4% in 2014 to 25.9% in 2019. Climate change was occurring much more quickly than expected or projected. Consumption and production patterns were not sustainable up to a considerable level. Oceans suffered from unsustainable depletion. Environmental deterioration happened. CO2 saturation, acidification, all increased. Forest areas continued to deplete at an alarming rate, and inequality continued to increase within and among countries. Of course, the effects of the pandemic have overwhelmed the health system globally and kept up to 90% of students out of school. This caused businesses, factories to shut down, disrupted global value chains, supply of products, pushed 71 million people back into extreme poverty, and caused 132 million more people to suffer from undernourishment in 2020 alone. Also, in 2020, the world faced the worst economic recession since the last Great Depression, and there was a 4.2% decline in real GDP per capita. World trade plunged by 13 to 32%. 400 million job losses occurred globally in the second quarter of 2020 alone. And more alarmingly, the pandemic is affecting the world's poorest and the most vulnerable people more. So, the actual implementation of sustainable development goals, which were meant for these poorest and most vulnerable people, had a major setback. Obviously, in both advanced and developing economies, the inequalities have become more and more harsh. Uh, Along with it, the gender divide has further widened. Many women are facing increased economic insecurity just because of the pandemic. Cases of domestic violence have increased by 30% in some countries. Job losses have hit women more. Additional care work due to the closure of schools, daycare centers have burdened the women more in household jobs. Being on the front lines in fighting the coronavirus also puts women at greater risk, as they account for almost 70% of health and social workers globally. Again, the children are one of the worst sufferers. Both infant mortality, maternal deaths have increased many fold. Prolonged absence from school results in lower retention rates, graduation rates, worsen learning outcomes even. It also has an adverse effect on the social and behavioral development of the children because more families fall into extreme poverty, resulting in keeping children in poor and disadvantaged communities and at much greater risk of child labor, child marriage, and child trafficking. In fact, the global gains in reducing child labor are likely to be even reversed for the first time in 20 years. So that shows the the vulnerability of this group against the perils of the pandemic. Over and above of these unforeseen challenges, that are plaguing the development issues all over the globe, absence of data is worsening the scope of analysis further. It has created a hindrance in revealing the true picture, and the data analysis availability for global indicators for sustainable development goals that reveals that for 4 of the 17 goals, less than half of the countries have adequate or internationally comparable data. And this lack of country level data is worrisome even for goal 5. And on average, only 4 in 10 countries have the data available. What's more, even countries with available data have only a small number of observations over time, making it difficult for the policymakers to monitor progress and identify trends. However, on the positive side, this pandemic has contributed as an eye-opener for the policymakers worldwide. Aside from the weakness of health systems, the pandemic also exposes us how far we are from achieving many of these goals, including the lack of education facilities, inadequate clean water and sanitation, crisis in poverty and food security. Equitable economic growth and sustainable use of the planet's natural resources has perhaps got the maximum focus due to the pandemic, which expected if the pandemic had not been there. In the face of the pandemic, the next phase of UNDP's COVID-19 crisis response is designed to help decision makers look beyond recovery towards 2030, making choices and managing complexity and uncertainty. It covers majorly 4 areas. Firstly, governance by building a new social contract with reduced corruption, increased governmental effectiveness, and increased democracy, thereby also confirming inclusivity. Secondly, the social protection by uprooting inequalities, that is focused through increased enrollment in completion of education at all levels, higher social transfers, and increased protection of nutrition for the less skilled and therefore lower income families, greater societal focus on improving access to safe water and sanitation, electricity, modern cook stoves, and increased supportive government expenditures on education and health. Of course, the implementation of sustainable development goals majorly rests on these areas. Thirdly, by encouraging green economy, that is nothing but rebalancing nature, climate, and economy, going to be harnessed by reduction of agricultural waste in production, transport and processing, consumption, increased agricultural yields, allowing increased forest area, reduced urban air pollution, increased efficiency of water and energy use, accelerated technological advancement, and the policy emphasis on renewable energy. This is going to definitely figure out how far the human society is inclined towards making the planet a better place to live in. Finally, focus should be on innovation by increased emphasis on tertiary education, especially in science, increased governmental and societal spending on research and development, accelerated introduction of fixed and mobile broadband technology, including mobile phones, to bring in the digital disruption. Of course, this digital disruption is going to take us ahead with the aid of technology towards more and more research and development and innovating better formats of living for the humankind. Targeted intervention in the implementation of sustainable goals would reduce the number of people living in extreme poverty by 146 million in 2030. So that's a golden line in this darkness. Approximately 128 million adults, 16 million children are expected to be lifted out of malnutrition. Proportion of children completing secondary school education would also rise from estimated completion rate of 66% to 70%. The future, however bleak it may look like now, has to be turned towards positive human development through the concerted efforts of us all, the state, the private, and the public organizations, and obviously the social groups. Given that the goals incorporate the four pillars of capital, that is, human capital, social, natural, and physical, these targets will be useful in the post pandemic economic recovery of all countries. An improvement in SDG indicators will have a spillover effect on a country's EDB ranking as well, which captures the relative ease with which countries can attract foreign investment and businesses. Obviously, such attractiveness to business, in turn, is crucial for the post pandemic recovery of the developing economies, and the policymakers must not lose sight of the challenges in implementing these SDGs. These challenges were even predating the current crisis. So, obviously, challenges to the 2030 agenda include a rough start to the decade of action. There are skepticism coupled with the difficulty in achieving goals and a widening resource gap. But obviously, governments and other international players must come together with renewed political will and engagement. To recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, we must put people at the center of the response to achieve more equitable and resilient outcomes for all. The SDGs and the Paris Agreement are our compass to a transformative recovery that reduces the risk of future crisis, brings the inclusive and sustainable development. So let us all hope for a better tomorrow. Thank you.